Welcome to the art lecture series. Today we have a wordsmith for our series, someone that works in poetics, Buzzeo. She is coming to us from Brooklyn, and I'm going to read a little bit about her work from Rob Halpern. She's written 4 books, most recently The Devastation, For Want and Sound, What Began Us. What's the 4th one? Face. So this is from For Want and Sound. For Want and Sound is a book about the body and the sentence, at once grammatical and juridical. It concerns language and law, force and longing, and the fate of love that can't be contained by our sentences, there being no socially sanctioned form for that excess. How is one to communicate a sentence whose subject wants more than grammar allows? And what might this want sound like? And then this is Melissa's own writing at the end of a piece called The Devastation. The devastation is based on the fallibility of a single image, a sea wreck in language. If water is desire, connectivity, the possibility of current, language itself, what happens when that water is emptied out, when nothing is left but the basin of retrieval, the properties of the body, and the memory of matter addressed? So Melissa Buzzeo writes about one of the things that she's interested in is the body. And when I asked her about the body, because it's a term that's such a big term that kind of gets hollowed out, she's interested in the confluence of language and how it connects to the body. And specifically, she's done quite a bit of work around healing and the poetic. She participated in a coming together of 6 poets around the poetics of healing. And thinking, we were talking about these sort of empathic space between that happens around poetry as an encounter, as a practice, and a kind of carnation of, or a duration rather, of an empathic space. She currently is teaching at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. And she has also taught was a visiting writer at Brown. She has a BA from Cornell and an MFA from the University of Iowa's writing workshop. So, Melissa, thanks for coming. Let's welcome Melissa.
So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. To everybody I know, and it's been so welcoming to me. Thank you to people I don't know. Thank you too. I got off the plane in Seattle and just felt like so much lighter and happier immediately. So I'm just like, for some reason, just so happy to be here. So thank you. And thank you for that lovely intro, Shaw. I'm going to read from my new book, The Devastation, and then also read from a very, very rough new work that I'm trying to do, and sort of talk about them both a little bit as well. And I just want to encourage everybody, though, to ask me any kind of questions afterwards that you're thinking of. Like, nothing would be too weird. I'm really, really open, and I see writing definitely as a space of encounter and as a space for making new kinds of relationships possible, and also kind of new kind of writers possible. So I'm also really interested in like how writing made a life possible for me, and how that in turn makes it possible for many other people too. And so I'm just gonna first read a very brief thing that I wrote about my new book called The Devastation. And it has some of the same language that Shaw was talking about too, so, but maybe hearing it the second time, it'll make sense. So the project is this, a work titled The Devastation, based on the fallibility of a single image, a sea wreck in language. If water is desire, connectivity, the possibility of current, language itself, a concept investigated directly in much of my previous work, my other books. What happens when that water is emptied out, when nothing is left but the basin of retrieval, the properties of the body, and the matter of memory addressed? Further, what happens to language, to the body, when this address has disappeared? What happens to death? What happens to life? Clotted, closeted, and unrealized in all this then. At the bottom of the sea, unidentified lovers have survived the devastation. The water as it violently emptied, the pronouns as they disappeared into the marine biology of the ocean floor. Covered in decayed matter, that of the floor, that of themselves, what was once human skin, reeking of a terrible stench, the lovers repeat this one gesture, reaching and pulling off from the other the clotted elements of the sea. The once animals, plants, this matted reach. All that is left of language in an alternative system of life. They reach and they recoil in a gesture of extreme eroticism. Extreme because it is all that is left, because it combines what is left and pushes against limit. Erotic because it is the ultimate reach, through nothing, back to oneself, the other body at the limit of self. And the epigraph comes from a philosopher called Blanchot, the danger that the disaster acquire meaning instead of the body. So I was just really interested in, when I first began the book, in really thinking, investigating that idea. It began as a book that was to address healing, text after loss. As Devastation often does, it became all loss, and as such, what to do with a language smaller and smaller, a meaning more and more totalitarian. What to do with a book enacting itself. These fields of yearning or narrative held so far apart. And further, what is the role of community in linguistic trauma? How to speak in the absence of address, the pre-language torn away, the mirrors broken on the floor, the form, all forms, eradicated, displaced, done away with, abbreviated in an economy that does not weigh the silent aspect of address, the nothing aspect, content and form held so far apart. And really, this book is about meaning, I would say. I'm gonna read from the first part. It's kind of a durational work, and so all the parts are very, very different, and they don't really work on themselves so much, but it's about like moving just in like the way life is, like where you get to the next part with the memory of the last part, and it changes the next part, right? So it often works like that, and so when I read from it, I've often been just mixing it up, but I think today I'm just going to read the first section, which is very, very different from the other sections, and it's kind of this lyrical, this kind of last lyrical moment, and it's literally all the lines in the book are literally or the way I thought about it is the debris that the lovers are picking off each other. So like I'm thinking in this book as the lines of the book and writing itself as also like waste or not being able to even understand what is outside of a system of language, what would even be, what meaning would there even be, right? And so it's like, and then how to write a book under that constraint. But I guess, I went to a class visit the other day, Lunara's class, some of you were there, and just also just talking about the idea of what would make survival possible, and why would you want somebody else to survive, or how would that be possible outside of language too? So the lovers are literally going like this, and and the lines that fall from them is the lines of the book too. They're kind of like cleaning each other off. So this first section is very, very different from the other sections. It's still in that kind of moment right when that's happening. So even though there's a kind of memory of meaning or something like that, and there's still like a gesture of like absent lyric or something. Oh, and I should also say that I feel like the whole book was an effort to get through this line by Glissant from his Poetics of Relation that says, "We know ourselves as part and as crowd in an unknown that does not terrify. We cry our cry of poetry, our boats are open, and we sail them for everyone." How does one say the devastation when it no longer is? When I am not waiting for you, writing for you, when we are not intact? Impoverished speech filling this empty bed of sediment and debris in such overexposed light, how does one say? Against this one tree of fragment exposure, I lift your jacket, I lift your throat crustacean to substantiate shell. When we are no longer anything but these lanterns giving light, these colors abating chemicals, these elements that have been left out. To say that there are no more nutrients on the floor in the absence of covers, that there are no more dividers, only this white bed which grows larger and larger, only these books that lack cover or are all cover. No containers, a singularity that is approached and done away with, a singularity committed to memory, so stark against this speech. Turn the pages of my book for someone else to do it for you is erotic, for the broken steps of culture, for the bereavement that is palpable, the lightness of the page erotic. You start with an image, one that has been torn out of your mouth. You fold it in half, you stay. Beside what drained, beside what parted, beside what I had yet to be. You and I waiting for our belows to fill with water, for our bequeaths and our bequeathals, for the separation in the document, that which floated away, that which was held away, in the giving of no space, sea and rack beside what drained. The overexposure, particles of existence, the embrace global and guttural. We who can no longer say parched throats, water, pure pavement. We who can no longer remember the license that ran dry, the freedom on the periphery, your hands in waiting, in the no longer calculable dry. That this cannot be separate, that there is no text for mouth, no text for body, no text to follow this run dry, that this cannot be completed outside of itself. In the absence of covers, numbness, and decay, except for this clarity, this return, we who can no longer say parched throats and remember our faces and remember our extremities, as our below fills with water, memory pushed to the extreme. To search so long for the tie, that which was cut from someplace else, brought to someplace else to replicate being, to press the skin firmly into the future, to retrieve broken mouth to stone, my hand low in the river of elsewhere, what has been taken, what has not been allowed, all the waiting that has never been done, and the fear of separating from the start. To call you adjacent, to hear you adjacent, I send love to the fixed place, the overturned place, that which is embanked in silence, embarked in presence. A tie that would replace meaning, and to have one but not the other, to wade and evacuate before, skin, erasure before. In every article, in every containment, that which breaks, that which assumes article, and the frozen book, endless out of fear. In the gesture towards nothing, towards no one, language, passage erased, the sea capsized into itself, to hold you against that, to hold us against that, they, them, that. To stay here where there is nothing, not even bone breaking over skin, the long haul of nothing indivisible from self, to not imagine the evacuation of yourself, this self, a prism water breaking over bone, as stone once absorbed, beach bequeathal before, as language inscription bone, I can go no further than this kiss, this begun in being. Desiring nothing, the memory of hands, bones breaking into branches, clavicle memory, branch. Skeletal and reconfigured from someplace else, I leave you as I wake to you without language, skeletal, a mineral presence, and the particulars that juxtaposed met. They drew no breath, as this stay precluded only deposit resonance, that there is no other book, language forbidden and the return remedial, that the rhythm cannot be found as I hold you to weather, cannot be folded, placed against skin, in the language, ancient language of this body next to that, where the text breaks off to no other, folded over skin, correspondence are no longer, in the break of recovery of remembrance, in the inability to shift the pages. I make a list and it breaks off, and it binds itself. We filled our books with sand so they would not drain water. I can remember the periphery, the seaweed taking shape, in what was not embankment. The unarticulated branches, dulcitary, chasm, pause, the silt in the mouth of the ocean. all forms or no form, the body taking place. Over such ravage in the one sea kept, the one sea listened to, lavender and leaving and secreted oils, the scent past the ocean, in the inclaimable ravage of met, out of your hands, out of the metal that binds you, the metal between, after plunge, outside of sound, as you enter the bloodstream and bind yourself space. And our near arrival and our near discordance, tumble placard and met, wilting ravage and the sea, a blood that opens, a sound that nears, rushing to ravage, a darkening, deepening, distilling. Everything falling through page. Our wing stem attacked, our wingspan attacked. The measure of the sea and the limit of the sea, the dry bones, the overturned pages, the blank bones, measured and then missed. In this capacity for ruler and lunging, breast and bone, the sea. I take the scales, the lingering shells, the seaweed abasement, the rotted, the rusted, the perusals of scent and excume. Some days the oil that would cling to this page, the new patterns, flecks of skin broken off. Between skin and the page, the scales of hair littered off. As so quickly, this disappearance in someone else's arms. Dried against the shell, I have nothing left to give in this absence of element. As you turn, as we turn, as even the sand breaks off and comes back as being. A bone so clean it is a shell, a below so bestowed, a belonging after, and the hushed abasement, the light that comes through, the body that comes through, a shell that belongs only to air. I take my hands from the river, my stained clothes from the cover, as we become just the take of what leaves, as each cover cries out so vapidly for salt. In all the crumbling unwritten, lying over the fragment of the earth, pure parchment water, the seaweed dissolves, struggling of its nutrients, the stasis egregious, a moon shape, a glass shape, the relics of your face, the one cell released from the many, to lift the shadow from your head, what is brought to light but not to body, to write instead the beautiful passage, the fallen pretext, the etched out retrieval. We dive and also have yet to dive, presence next to presence in the falling chemicals. I want what you want at the other side of the river, and the beds that we made, the crashing of consonants next to constants, this hard enactment of speech next to matter, and the water that is left in future freeze of tree, the beds that we made, the cellular destruction, cellular retrieval, the embankment and the return, the broken gesture, calling. We look at the sand, we have no other word for water, no other one for now, all the books other. Flushed against the ready, the resume, the culture, flushed against the resemblance, turning to resemble itself. The broken weight of species, the threadbare Tracy's treaty, all that is possible and the binding and the weight. Someone must enter the inside space in their own weight, their own gravity, a weight flushed and a depth flushed, flesh threadbare. We have yet to include that which is possible, to resume our own weight of pages stuck together, of pages loosened, turn the pages of my book, induce gravity and speech, the edges to spread at arm's length and near spread. A positioning that is possible. We have our own weight to consider, and the bust and the speed of the bust at arm's length. All the traces of the trestle, indecipherable, undeniable, the call of trace to trace. For someone to bind you to it, your lips radiant and your length radiant, your statue redeemed. Turn the charge to include the book, not in stand and not inclusion, exclusion at arm's length. The wind is torn from elsewhere, this distance is not unique. There is the question of the passivity at large, the turning, the charging, the changing at arm's length. As the page is formatted to include duration, division, decision, erasure. Duration, the traces induction. As we spread our lips to the century, as the wind is not from elsewhere, but from your arms undeniably apart, as I wait, as you wait uncalled. The poem that is turning to include wait. Outside the deepening air, outside the changing spread, the culture invested in air. The duration erotic and the signs in the air, the seepage I love to consider. When all is threadbare and we read through cheesecloth and breakage and love, the residual, the culture in love. The flame I leave in the other room, on the table before the door, the hard door of renounce, the flame that is left but still lit, the blue ink, the memory of birds, the platelets, planked ink, left adjacent ajar so that we might continue, so that I might continue alone, the hard swallow of continue. I remember the textual city and the meaning of met, the many words for see, the ink on your hands, what I can't remember, recall, deliver, and the weight in our faces, the swallowed back body, pure fire water, unable to withstand sight. A hard city table, separate from table. I leave you there so that we might recall here, at the bottom of, floored. In the impossibility of getting close enough, I press against the water, which floods absence. Our skin comes off, it does not mean we touch. Our hands break off, we have yet to reach bottom. To go back and forth, the unlit room, the mineral, a boundarylessness, a sea, the meaning of embankment, that which makes freedom, that which takes it away. We found ourselves here. We reached towards the other animals, other particles of skin. Which has become in your mouth alone. I couldn't say see and so let it join. How does one say in the absence of text, in the nothing to carry, in the everything to renounce, that I want without article? And in the throat, the tangle growing inward, the long vowels held, the distant chemicals of renounce. And where is a poem that does not follow? We forget names, but not breath. We give up a heat that is not pure, it no longer matters. We filled our names with the book, our tongues with the tide, in the impossibility of growing, land or sea, of denouncing such magnificence caught in one word, the particle I lost to touch your skin. I followed what was formless to me. And why did I agree to such earth, such incremental excrement-covered earth? To want and to be tangential to want. In the dissolution of paper and the disuse of paper, and the ink on the skin instead of the letter rotted and the entry torn away. The book that comes apart in my hand, the book that is for you and not for you, and for a forked line, the bones held safely over the ocean, the swelling survival above the forked line. In neither of our hands how to direct this force, this break, and this body. You bang against the body bilingual until it breaks off, and you are not a title, and you can't be kept. And the air that is radiance breaks against you, and the sea that is permanence, that is private, overfull and breaking longing, overlonging, breaking, bonding met, my heart against this. And the unreachable mat of the shells in the air, the carved out space, to open a blank or flooded page to rupture and release. In the return to the other language, the words strained, fractured, and bent, the stiffness of the body bending over, and the inability to keep. I wanted these words in your body, this heart in your head. In the restraint of the other language, the gentle spillage, and the word by word pillage. To give up caught and catch and have and help. Only the covers left, the card covers of retreat. In the rain and the desire for the rain, in the return of the work and the swollen seepage, the seismic wreckage, these arms for yours, bent over spilling inwards, and the catastrophe of the over-language, the rain over your throat and the inability to keep cover alone, this avowal unmet, safe over the catch of irk, the wreck that is read alone, the marks we make and the seismic here, straining towards what? To breathe in and out, to desire in and out, the pages removed and the pages retorn, in the leap from desire and met, in the entangling of the species. The non-sea and the safety valve open, the near sea and the unraveling and the unfolding, to fold out of being near the sea and to break against rock. As we keep, what of breakage returns, what of stone survives, the book that is too heavy to keep, too light to lessen, and the brevity of caught, unfolding and unmaking for me and not for you, for you but only at a distance. In the lightness of the page erotic, plunged between the covers, loose between the covers, and rocking to sleep on someone else's boat, in someone else's sleep, over sea and nearness, and the rock of shell breaking over body, over book betrayal, over one language pulling out. In the inextricable memory of being, and I am quite near the sea, in the absence of address, and the body I make for you. This strain over that, in the other memory, in the other words, in the language that won't open, in the other who won't go to sleep, in the non-language of the book, and the tangled pages removed, over bone, over sea, over memory of sea, the torn gravity that pulls me to here, against the book that is neither open nor closed, neither seismic nor wrecked. It is too dark to see, and how long it took me to climb out of this body. We are bespoken by matter, and as such we cannot touch. Between us, blank line, between us a dankness that has been eradicated. Before us, blank light. To say that we have come from the same place, and how closely I resemble that which you are not, the before text, the after writing. I put my lips to yours, we try to pronounce these words. I cannot. and that we are swimmers together, that we missed the page, and that we are swimmers together. All the language in my throat, all the emptying out of language, on the floor sometimes spines of gold. In striated cells of longing, we hold the particles of water up to the light. How does one say the devastation when it no longer is, when we no longer are beside it? The nekton swimming, the plankton drifting, in the overlying water, crustacean pelagic. This hard glow next to meter, on ancient paper as we swam to each other, on ancient paper as we are to each other, demolished, measured net. And this is my way of staying connected to you outside this singular length. My body or both our bodies, at arm's length, at throat tied, this disbelief. To want and to want and to want and to have no recourse towards want. In this place of no roots to complete the exhaustion. Between the two notebooks, neither one breaking, neither one buried, the tissue paper, the sight one to the other, the translation buried, and the transition brought to light, the colors collected return, what one page collects of another, and the seeing through paper, and the never to be held, the last place and the first room, the white walls collapsing. Here the walls make paper, and also I make paper. In the unearthed garden, the open time, and at first to encounter the sea. Sometimes we hear the words lining the literal. Sometimes our hands undo the absence. Sometimes we remember the properties of matter, and as such, we cannot touch. The portion the sky took of our mouths. Still the hand breaches survival. Still the harvest speaks to itself. I want wrought iron and the sea. The earth trying to substantiate arrival, to subsume bequeathal. And can we call it a lost language? The translation redundant and bound to water. It is because we remember the water of before that we take our hands to skin. To have never left this broken text that we fold over skin, I had set out to write about the cold, the frozen freeing of form, but it no longer existed, but we no longer existed, this harsh formlessness over skin. How does one say of the devastation when it no longer is, that I made the bed with the book, that I had to unmake the bed, to remove the book, to remake the self? All the remnants of the drained text leaking in other language, a text outside of text, a room outside of room, between the two notebooks, the unaltered page, to be unable to pronounce evaporant, as I did before. A compression of all the other books, an evacuation of all the other books, the seed placed open where no sound can reach it. Brittle stars, basket stars, the exhaustion of substance for dead. Words were turning gold in the black sun of silence, buried in the seed bed, in swimming or drifting forms, in the overlying water, in pelagic communities, the radical symmetry, the return. All the other words for sea. When the adventure has reached its farthest point, when the sea listens only to the sea, writing suddenly appears as a broken coastline which no map records. The body is against the stone drawn, the body is cast into the sea. I give you this marked stone, and the water rose from the middle, and the sound followed the sea, no trace of blood. And then there were no more notebooks, because there was no more pretext. The blue was gone like her brown, bright in the market. Wind song, in the blue, the gray, the wind, the embroidered saris, the paper from Nepal, from India, paper someone touched. The plain school notebook prairie, the notebooks of rhythm and refusal, all bound together into nothing, which stood as one. So that's the end of the first section. And thank you. Thank you so much. And like I said, the rest is like very, very different, like formally and kind of thematically. And so the next thing, and that's the last thing I'm going to read, is very, very different work. This is just published, but it was obviously like written a while ago. And so this new work that I'm trying to do is this kind of very like high risk project for me. It's a kind of memoir, and I'm going to like read a little bit about it. And I haven't really read it in public, so it's very, very, very rough. And I also kind of truncated it to make it into like a piece to be able to read, maybe. So there's a lot of like elements that are missing that you might want to know. There's a lot of like kind of like race and class things that aren't appearing here, or things that appear later that would make this make more sense. But it's just very, very rough. And So I'm just gonna, just to kind of introduce it, it's called Writing. And I'm really thinking about I kind of call it a memoir, just to like trick me into doing it in some way. But I think I'm kind of thinking about the idea of like writing for me, just like the idea of writing, as you could probably see from that book, was really like the beloved. You know, it was like the highest thing for me, and I'm sure many people here feel that about their art or things they're doing, right? And so it was truly like the highest thing, and it wasn't even a concrete thing. It wasn't like, you know, this book is the best thing, or this person's writing is the best thing. It was just the idea of it for me. And I definitely had a life for a while that was life and text together, which is what I wanted very, very much. And that kind of breaking apart is what the Devastation is about. And then in this writing project, which is basically many years later, I'm trying to think about the fact that writing is no longer that for me, and trying to think about what it is for me. And that difference has been very hard to live with, right? And also to kind of come back from. And it kind of brought me back to like a lot of trauma that I had when I was younger that I never saw as being connected in any way, that I'm seeing as very, very connected. And so I'm gonna, and because it's so rough and it's such a mess, I'm just gonna read a tiny bit of, so I just recently did an interview with Banu Kapil, who's another writer, on her blog, and she said, how would you distinguish this new work, Writing, from the Devastation? So it's kind of like a good segue into this. And I said, the book I'm trying to write now, Writing, is in prose, and it is only something that someone who has lived a lot would write. The Devastation is love poetry, and even in loss of belief, pure belief. I had pleasure at certain times writing it. I wrote it to divide the past from the future and to make a strong future. I was working on ideas, violence in community, waste, survival, relation. I came back to it, I finished it, I read a lot. At the end of the book, I felt just like the lovers of the book. I was naked on the floor in writing. In the new time, everything, although it had been hard, worked. Everything I did. I thought that things could change, that I or anyone could work on changing them. Slowly, I watched them start to change. I felt great power come through me as I began to finish the book. I was willing to be naked and with the other naked people. This new time was also the time of the Occupy and also the time of the Haiti earthquake. Like everyone else, I was affected by those things. This memoir or writing is more literally about being at a loss, like that expression of being at a loss, like as though a place. So you can't really say it is not real, broken glass. I don't know what to do with it besides look away. I can't call it something else. It is about concrete things, the connection between passivity and agency, the power and powerlessness, the town in which I grew up where many women of all ages were sick from breast cancer, but I did not know. Seeing my mother is rejected in multiple ways body the exact same way I'm seeing all writing now and rejecting it now, bisected in scars, overbloated from past toxins, not able to talk, overly conscious, deliberately unconscious, about to die, and in and of a very particular female disease, the experience of which is separable from the patriarchal culture of which it fuels. There are many, many things that make it hard to feel good about this. Like, is it even possible to create horizontal alliances in writing when there are none in life? And that's basically a big, huge project of this book. I didn't used to see it like that. I'm trying to find them at a deeper level, or to try to do something with the very small bits of them. At the same time, I have never loved anything more, and so it's a trap. And it is this trap, and in trying to love it like this especially, and to think it could do something now. And I'm not gonna have another life, and this is it. It's really influenced by Anne Boyer's work, the Guy Barrett AIDS books, and this great collectively written poem from the No Manifesto for Poetry Readings and Listservs, kind of like an anti-rape thing. I also realized how weird and psychoanalytic and awful this project is. It is different from my past work because I was a writer writing those things, and now I am not. I think I used to see writing as the earth flourishing or going to flourish, or as a body flourishing or capable of flourishing, and so beautiful. And in that flourishing, capable of connecting with many other things, then I saw it like this. It is a very hard position to write from. I get that it might be impossible. It feels like this huge risk, but that I am already pushed into the risk, and it is something I did not choose and feel so uncomfortable. I miss writing poetry. I somehow believe that if I do this, I can write poetry again. A long, epic, communal poem is what I would most like, or just even a notebook, or especially a baby book. It is all or nothing, or it feels like that for my own life. I have ideas like I want the book to enact mutual aid, which is an anarchist term, or I want the book to be a history of sexuality, or I want the book to be for and with all women identified, and whatever that means. It is a story of how I wanted no division, text in life, and how I got that, and how that was very hard to live with, or extract from, or of how, if anything, I was the daughter of this small poetry world too, and that was one of the many systems that made me. So I'm gonna read like about 15 pages or something like that of this work, and it's, like I said, they took some things out, and it's kind of truncated to make it into a piece. And the epigraph comes from Anne Boyer, who's a good poet. I am not writing a history of these times, or of past times, or of any future times, or not even the history of these visions, which are with me all day and all of the night. And so from writing. They wore safety pins to cover their genitals, or they wore baby Dale dresses she made herself, so unflattering, or she saved something for herself and often wore this, and they picked up shifts and wore them, and she would run through the blue hydrangea in the summer to her best friend's house, and they wrote plays and played air guitar and drove many miles in the expressway to someone's garage to watch some obscure punk band they had read about in some staple piece of paper because they were riot girls or they were very good students, and they waited out the flood, and they waited for the millennium just like that. She had a secret, and the secret had an odd shape because outside of it there was nothing, and the secret had no name. And because of this, she couldn't feel it in the normal way or in any way or know what it was. But it pulled on her too, and it pulled hard, and it made her body into something different than what it could have, might have been. And she had a beautiful lover once, a faun, who had submitted a proposal to rebuild the World Trade Center. And his idea was to make 2 holes in the ground as deep as the towers had been tall and just as wide, and to just leave them like that. And I can see them how they might have looked, and I can imagine the glass covering that might have been made for the tops. And I can lay on that glass now and look down and down and down for a very long time and be perfectly still. And it is night, and it is safe somehow in the open, so safe that I can look down at the secret and at the shape and not feel it in blood and honeysuckle, as I would so like to right now. And she could walk out on the creek dock in the middle of winter scantily dressed in a thrift store nightgown and someone else's too big coat and be cold and alone for a very long time and stare at the water and all its different lights. And her body became a secret. Later, she dated a girl who was older than her, a writer, and this other girl was her great love because this other girl understood her and held her often and made her grow. And this other girl said that she had written in blood on the sheets once when she was in college in her blood, after cutting herself the word help. In her careful and purposeful handwriting, she was sent to the hospital. Then she became a writer and became a lesbian. And her philosophy thesis' major point was that experimental women writers from the 1990s could do philosophy better than its history, which was the history of philosophy. She loved the other girl because the other girl said that someday she might kill herself if life became unbearable, and later asked her if they should do it together, drown in the Hudson with no note. But she loved her in the meantime before the suicide for her belief in all things. The coffee cup had meaning, as did some folded up piece of paper, and one could become a person in the world by sheer will. She was an aspirant, the other girl, and she was also a cup, and she cupped her hands like that too, and she became a vessel too like that. And in her blue-painted room, I painted myself. I was 20, and in the night, she would immediately enter into a trance and talk to God because she was so lonely, and there was just nothing else possible. Her mother had said she'd given her to Mary, who would always protect her, and her grandmother, when her mother was sick, had said she was also given her daughter to the Virgin Mother, so how could this have happened? And she liked icons, and she liked it when Eva Perón raised her arms and said, Des camisados, and she liked it when Courtney Love got to kiss her boyfriend in pajamas and had a band too, a better band, and it was all decorated, this childhood, pink and gold and blue and very plain. And she could never understand what they were talking about. How could you give your daughter away and still have her? There were so many different documents, and I raised my arms like that too so many years later, and so she prayed to God in a kind of utter helplessness because she did not understand what it meant to pray to Mary, who was too close and too remote, too beautiful and too far away. There was no agency, but there was right into the Holy Spirit, although she did not know what this meant until a psychic told her many years later. And as the Ithaca blank light penetrated her further and further, she grew more and more unbelieving, not of God per se, but of all things. But she would not have said it like this. She would have said nothing. And one day she cut her long hair, and this released something. Some birds flew out of it then, and it made it so she was more like the time she had been born into. And often as a teenager, she would cut high school when she had her period or when she cried a lot. She would cut to be private, and the sun was so luminous, and she didn't want to miss it for it to happen without her, and she tried to draw her arms around it, and she tried to cut it out to have its outline, but mostly she was content to watch it as she lay on her belly in its wake. Because later, out of desperation, she merged with it the time she had been born into and born out of, because she saw that as a woman and as herself, she could never have been a poet in any earlier time than this. And poetry is the most important thing to her, and she yearned in a broken way to live in another way. She couldn't put things together. This has happened because this had. She had almost no interest in school, and in this school in particular, although she remembered being quite interested, remembered walking to the library with some complicated hairstyle all those years of childhood and having a lot of feeling in the library, a feeling now gone. She was an English major, but she read very few books. She would try again and again with all those long, overwrought novels and not be able to tell what any of the sentence meant. She would try again the same sentence and not be able to understand what had just happened or remember. She would try a few times with each sentence before she remembered how she had wanted so much to study literature, but just move on in failure and still got very little out of books. And then she would have to write her papers from the memory of the books she had read with feeling in high school in the library in her small public town. Often one of those books would be on the list of 12 that you can choose from, and because there was no other option, she would choose this book and go to the library and try to get it and try to have memory, and would pick out some passages in a kind of confusion and loss, and her paper would be confused by trying to empty the unsophisticated consciousness of the young girl who had read that book as a child into the empty mind of the young woman, a college student who was supposed to be at a top-rate college. And she would be able to see inside the paper, too, at the only consciousness that was left after the panic that this process would create in her, and she slowly accepted college as failure. Thus, the things she remembered or learned were very few, but she remembered something about some red curtains and the buildings Ramon and being surprised that this meant masturbation, and also some things about what war might do to literature or what literature might do to war. And one day in the library, instead of studying for the astronomy test, a class she had taken because she thought it would be like The Little Prince, and therefore kind of emptied out philosophy, although philosophy didn't mean anything to her at the time, it was for the rich kids, a class she had taken and been disappointed in because what she understood most from the class or from her own confusion in it, as she had great difficulty reading textbooks of any kind as well, that there was no meaning in the sky. Just a lot of shatter in the textbook, and as she tried with great difficulty to be able to leave the college and the white sky, she saw a book on the floor, and it was called, and this is for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. And instead of trying to understand the sky or the textbook or how to be any kind of a student, she read the whole thing right then in the middle of the night and cried for the only time in all of college. Something had gone wrong almost as soon as she got to the college, which she didn't realize was something has always been wrong with her, but had been held together by whatever spirit was. The way she could look at a rose she'd pick for hours, or how she admired her own blood, or unlike anyone she knew liked being a woman and never thought it was less, but rather something special and extraordinary, and the overwhelming feeling of separateness or connection she sometimes felt in the town that was so horrified by her story that they left her completely alone to have this feeling and to wear her mother's clothes and to try and still feel close to her, and in all the silence to have her own private meaning, which was like drenched light, that she could hold, that could be shook out, and things could fly out of them, and she could hold them. But something had gone wrong, and the sky in Ithaca was always so white, and she was without the 4 o'clock sun in her attic bedroom and her friends and her painful but very real home full of pain and light, where no one said anything. And when nothing to hold it together, things began disappearing right into the sky, which could not hold her, very white. And sometimes she felt some of the sky was falling on her like powder, and she would brush it off. She didn't want to be part of it, or for it to be part of her. She spent many years reading many secret books, and these books were the kind that many people lived and held. And it was always her great wish to be special and unspecial too, to be part of her time too. And the books were about near-death experiences or angels or some kind of burned-out spirituality by someone too hurt to talk about it. And she did all the exercises in those books, and she waited 5 years for a vision from her mother, and she tried to connect with her angel guides and see the beautiful wing flutter against her, and for and to feel deeply loved and capable of so much, the chakra color running right out of her straight into belief that her mother still existed somehow and loved her still, but this never happened. And there was a kind of grace underneath, although I could not touch it, and the waiting was endless. And she was happy, too, watching the calm of the person under a trance in her bed and the past life regressions. She did, and by the beautiful and mundane things they said, the bits of other life, complete and incomplete, the making of the butter, the feeling of the knife, the storing of the things under the locked box under the bed, and the having of the babies, the feeling of the knife through the skin, the catching of the ball, the groaning of the turnip, the child walking away, the taking of the very long walk, and the recognition which in another way might mean falling in love again and again, the same and different, in so many different ways to so many different people. Look down at your clothes, she would say. And she would say, look into the eyes of the person you are talking to. Do they remind you of anyone? And are you a boy or a girl, a man or a woman? And what color is your skin? But mostly she didn't say anything, and she tried not to leave, but just to be with them so that they weren't alone and scared. And they could see their hand and their hands end. And she loved to hear all the different languages, especially when they were ones she did not know. And she loved to hear the street signs. And she was scared, too, when they would die each time at the end of life, and then they would feel pain. And sometimes they'd be writhing and clutching in the bed if it was that kind of death. And she would be very interested in what they would say after about the death that they had learned from, that life, after the death, what they had learned from that life in such a beautiful and plain way, the form that came from the life that was over now, a form that was lifted out of that which was gone, and that what they should have done differently in the depths that were left to the other people who were also moving and who also had depths to them. And she would feel the calm and happiness the other person felt, the transformational that would last long after the trance, from the knowledge and belief that relationships, if not life, were complicated and internal and constantly moving. And she was sad, too, that she couldn't be changed by this herself and understand things about her own life in this way because no one could put her in a trance, and she knew she was not trusting enough to be able to experience the parallel narrative before poetry when she was 20. She knelt down to pray on a hill in the honeysuckle. This was her special place. And when she was a child and her brother and sister and all the neighbors would go to the school playground to play, she would often go with them, but then would go there alone here to this hill which encircled the fields. And she had read a book about a soldier in World War I who was disfigured from mustard gas, and his face was ruined and his hands unworkable forever, and he's just 21 and has to come home to Kansas, to a small town that rejects him so completely as the memory of the Great War and all that is unbearable. And she was to learn from a film school friend many years later that he was the prototype for the Hollywood monster, created at this time in collective unconscious, conscious guilt and yearning, and he obviously had no place in life as it continued. And at the convalescent hospital, he meets the preteen daughter of the doctor, and they make friends, and it is so difficult, but also healing, and they are not lovers. And I was so filled with guilt as though I had been a person in that town, and I was aware that in the 1990s, most of the people from that time were dead, and I was relieved that the suffering was over for them because she knew that only death could end that which was irreversible, and she prayed for them in the truth and fiction of the honeysuckle, and out of guilt, and out of the desire to be extraordinary instead of what I was, and she was 13 and was so sorry, and my mother was very sick. And she was very sick, but she'd been a real person, and she'd been someone who had lived, and she wanted me to live like that, and I wanted to. And she was very sick, but she hadn't been. She had been this young and shy woman that everyone called so beautiful, and she was my mother, and she tried very hard with me. And one of the ways that she tried very hard was that after she'd been so disfigured, after she'd been so brain damaged and could not move, she sat in front of me to her mother, who was beautiful of figure and face in the 30s and the 80s, and in the time of her midlife when her husband fucked the young girl. And her life was over. It was clear at that part. Her body was not part of presence, and I wore a white bathing suit that had been hers because we were no longer a family that did normal things like go and buy clothes, much less bathing suits. And I was not beautiful at all because she was 12 but looked 17, without the openness and becoming of a young girl at that time. And she was someone who did not know how to put a tampon in because no one had ever taught her. And she could not look at another woman's naked chest, she said so often. But as I was about to go to the beach party in her bathing suit she would never wear again, she said in front of me to her own mother, "Doesn't Melissa have a beautiful body?" Although she could not look at another woman's chest. And she always felt like her mother had said that to help her, that she knew it was going to be hard for her, that she wanted to try and help her, and it helped her later. And she was a young woman, and her mother had been a young woman too, and she had married her father because her father had cheated on her mother with a young woman, and she was going to stay with her mother in a glass globe and die, or she was going to drive 2 hours to a punk show in someone's basement and live. And the question of her body came up often. And so she knelt and she prayed, and she stopped praying. She started reading self-help books, and then she stopped reading spiritual self-help books and started not sleeping instead. And her mother had tried to help her in other ways she thought so later, even though it was never that she was going to die until the very last day, even though it was always that breast cancer was very, very curable. It was, in fact, the best kind of cancer to get for a young woman, and all that had happened was just the side effects of the medication and wouldn't be reversed. When it was over, the last time her mother was in her room before she was so damaged, brain damaged, she could not go upstairs, she touched all her things and told her that she had wanted a daughter so much, but that she had been so much more than what she wanted, and that she had been the best part of her life, that she had gotten to be her mother, that God had given her to her, that she had been so lucky that sometimes she could not imagine what she had done to have deserved her so much more than she wanted daughter. But it was not serious talk or did not mean anything more than the beautiful sun in her bedroom and how it lay on the gold and the flowers and the cloth-covered books. But she was glad that her mother loved her and had made her life happy. And then after saying this, her mother was so tired that she went to sleep on her twin bed, even though it was the middle of the day in the summer, and she was 38 and she was 11, and she got into bed with her and also went to sleep, and also their cat was dying then. And I have tried to write this simple paragraph many times and have not been able to do it, from her voice or from my voice or from the room, or just voice, but none of it works because although it came from voice then, it is not coming now, and it is very split now, so much that it can't come from writing, which has no voice anymore, but only through it. And every night, her mother would lean over her and say a prayer to Jesus to protect her, to keep her always healthy and happy and safe with her mother and father who would protect her always. But really, they should have prayed for her, for what was coming, or for the whole town, for there were many people who were sick in that town right then, but they did not know, and most of these were women. And had they known, they would not have been able to understand together, and the understanding of many things was kept at a purposeful minimum. And her mother had made up a story for her when she was a little girl, and the story was a very unexceptional story that maybe had come from elsewhere, a little girl with a muff, a glass globe, Russia, and there was a sleigh. And when she was sick, they talked about this story because they both had great, all of a sudden, desire to go backwards. And her mother said that she could someday write it someday because she knew she wanted to be a writer. But she said, no, we have to write it together. And they fought over this, as they never did. But eventually, her mother gave in to her. She always did. And she said, okay, we will write it together. And it will be nice to see both our names on the cover of the book. And she was happy, even though she had not been worried, because it meant her mother would live. And when she was 17, she found some papers in a drawer in her house, and her shaky, brain-damaged handwriting, before she was really brain-damaged and did not know her mother had tried to write the story for her, not as they would write it together, but in a way she might have told it herself. And that was one of the last things she did, that she tried to write this for her daughter. And she never read it, and it was hard to read all brain-damaged, but I was her daughter still. And the next year, she wrote it herself when she was 16, and she won a prize and then won other prizes for writing the article on Russia after perestroika or for being student co-chair of the town flood relief. And this is part of the reason she went to the fancy college she never knew to want to go to begin with. And what her mother had written had been incomplete, but this is what she was thinking as she lay dying and knowing and not knowing and making this story for her. And she must have remembered one day how she had promised her daughter that they would write it together someday. And maybe this is when she thought to herself that it is irreversible now. I do not know, but she probably remembered. She had promised her, and she was going to be very upset if the promise was not kept. And so one day she must have said, now I have to do this for my daughter. Because she was the little girl with the muff, and in the unexceptional story, there were no grown women. And what she had written had also been unexceptional, but so complete it said nothing, and she was bored with it and never looked at it again, although it had won a prize. And she had written it to remember it because she wanted to remember it later, for she was terrified of forgetting, although later she forgot nothing, and it was not reiterating to her, although she did not know why. And I couldn't read it. I wouldn't read either now if I had a chance today, even though I'm writing this. It wouldn't help me. And it never occurred to her to put them together, or how one might help the other, carry the failure of the other, or transfer the feeling to the other. And in the funeral, she led the procession with her father, for she was the oldest holding her hand, and everyone stared at her, for they had not known, and she curled her hair for the funeral and wore a blue ribbon in her hair as her mother would have liked, and she tried to be a little girl again, and the coffin was closed. But in the coffin, she put many things she could not remember now, but poppy seeds they might have planted, and a letter she wrote to her that looked like a soggy sanitary napkin that she kissed all over, and her mother's lipsticks over her mouth. And she wrote that on her desk the morning they told her that her mother had died, after being told the day before for the first time ever that she might die. And that was the last real writing she did before she was 22 and was wanting to be a poet and was having sex for the first time. And probably she said, I love you, and she probably said, I will always be your little girl, but the rest she could not remember. Such a long letter, and she came downstairs after writing to see her father's mother ironing a dress for the coffin, but not a pretty dress, a dress she'd worn when she had been sick and wanted to hide her body, and she said no and picked a dress herself, a dress that an attractive young woman might wear, girlish and yellow with eyelet sleeves, that she'd worn to a picnic when she'd gotten a job as a teacher finally, and that meant that they could buy a house someday. And her grandmother didn't argue with her and said okay, and she said with force, "Mommy likes this better." And that was the last time she said anything with force for a very long time. And they promised her they would put her letter in the coffin as she was asked. And at the wake, the priest talked about purgatory a lot, and she said out loud without thinking, but why would she be in purgatory? She already suffered so much. And she wrote her name first in the guest book the funeral home had. She wrote her name first, her first name, or the nickname the family had for her, and her brother and father and sister did the same, their first names in the institutional record, and this is the last thing they did for her. It was a closed casket because if everyone said she would never want anyone to see her like this, and I never thought to ask if I could see her, and it was true, she did not want to be seen like this. But she was her daughter still, whether the casket was open or closed, and in the time afterwards, when they were not supposed to talk about her, she was the proof in the flesh that her mother had lived, and more than this, that she had breathed life into her. Thank you.